It's my understanding that he really didn't want to debate the resurrection when arrangements for this were being made.
That's right. He said, I'm not going to debate the resurrection of Jesus. What I want to debate is the historical reliability of the Gospels. And it seemed to me that that was just an unmanageable topic. I mean, imagine just trying to debate the single subject of the historical reliability of the Gospel of Luke. Just that topic alone. Yeah. And then pull in the other synoptics, and then pull in John, and you can see you just have an impossible topic for a 90-minute debate. So I said, no, I want to focus on a specific event in the Gospels, namely the resurrection of Jesus. And Richard agreed, all right, we'll do that. We'll talk about the resurrection. And therefore, I was so surprised in his opening statement when he got up to speak, and what did he do? He launched into a general attack upon the reliability of the Gospels, claiming they're mythical and giving examples of things in the Gospels that he thought were just symbolical and not meant to be historical, rather than coming to grips with the four facts that I claim undergird the inference to Jesus' resurrection.
Looking over Richard Carrier's material before the debate, do you get the impression that he thinks that Christ is not historical, that Jesus didn't actually exist?
Well, that is his most recent position. Much of his material was published before he came to this view of a purely mythical Jesus. So, for example, in one of his articles that he published criticizing me, he makes a statement that few people would deny that there is a historical core concerning Jesus of Nazareth and the people and characters about him that can be profitably mined by the historian for genuine historical information about Jesus. And the point that I was making in the debate, that part of that historical core that is recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today are facts like the burial in the tomb, the discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Those are part of that historical core that Richard admits most scholars recognize. But now he has moved away from believing that even there is a historical core, and he thinks it's all purely mythological and symbolical.
Many of us anticipated that Richard Carrier would talk about Paul's view of the resurrection body. Did he go that direction?
No, he did not in the debate. This is the centerpiece of his argument in the book, The Empty Tomb. And it's interesting, Kevin, because listeners may not be aware of the fact that this is actually a very old strategy that is characteristic of mid-20th century Protestant liberalism with respect to the resurrection. Protestant liberals could not believe in the literal physical resurrection of Jesus because it's a nature miracle, and liberal Protestants just couldn't swallow miracles. So what they wanted to argue was that the resurrection of Jesus, though a real event, was a non-physical event. Jesus rose spiritually from the dead while his corpse rotted away in the tomb. And the disciples then had visions, spiritual, non-physical visions of Jesus. And this enabled Protestant liberals to affirm the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, but denying the empty tomb and the physical post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And the strategy of these Protestant liberals was to drive a wedge between Paul and the Gospels. The strategy was to say that Paul believed in a purely spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection, and moreover that Paul's information is the earliest we have and therefore represents primitive, original Christianity, and that the Gospels came along much later and represent a legendary, later, redacted, theologically reflected kind of Christianity rather than the original Christian belief. And now what's happened is that Carrier, from a naturalistic point of view, adopts the same strategy that these Protestant liberals adopted and tries to employ it to show that, in fact, Christianity is just a myth, that it really isn't true at all, that Jesus isn't risen from the dead, that as naturalists we should think that all of this is just legendary and mythological. But the strategy is the same as these liberals in the mid-20th century. Now, what he doesn't recognize, is that this traditional liberal strategy came under sustained and overwhelming criticism in the latter half of the second part of the 20th century, so that today the wide majority of commentators on Paul's theology agree, first of all, that when Paul talks about a spiritual body, he's not talking about the substance of the body, he's talking about its orientation. The body is spiritual in the sense that we say the Bible is a spiritual book, or Billy Graham is a spiritual man. We don't mean that they are some sort of invisible, intangible, unextended thing made out of spirit. We're talking about the orientation or character of these
you
things.
can pick the Bible up. Your hand will not go through it.
Right.
You can shake
right.
Billy Graham's hand.
That's right. He's not like Casper the Ghost, which is the analogy that Richard used to describe Paul's doctrine of the resurrection body, that it's like Casper the Ghost, which is just crazy.
And he claims that Paul actually used language to indicate this. I mean, he tries to go to 1 Corinthians 15 and show that Paul...
Yes, he tries to use Paul's expression, spiritual body, to interpret it that way. Well, the problem is Paul uses the same language, Kevin, in the same letter in 1 Corinthians in chapter 2 to talk about the contrast between the natural man and the spiritual man. And obviously, by the spiritual man, Paul doesn't mean the immaterial, massless, unextended man. He's talking about people who are filled with the Holy Spirit and under the direction and control of God's Spirit. The contrast between the natural man and the spiritual man is not one of substance, but of orientation. And the same is true of the contrast between the natural body and the spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15. And as I say, this is what most commentators think. The other thing that most commentators came to recognize is that Paul believed in a transformation of the earthly body to the resurrection body. That the way the resurrection comes to be is through a transformation of the remains of the earthly body, not an exchange of one body for another different, numerically non-identical body. And therefore, Paul most definitely would believe in the empty tomb. He would think the graves would be empty when the resurrection occurs. But Richard, as I say, doesn't take any cognizance whatsoever of this sustained criticism of the old Protestant liberalism, which he, in effect, is still espousing.